Medieval peasants are often seen as poor and struggling all the time. But is that the full story? Before you decide, it helps to take a closer look at what their lives were really like, beyond the usual stories everyone knows. When we think of medieval peasants, we often picture starving people eating dirt and bugs to survive. But the truth is a bit different. Their meals weren't fancy five-course dinners, but they weren't constantly on the edge of starvation either. The daily diet of a medieval peasant centered around bread, lots and lots of bread. Unlike our fluffy white supermarket loaves, peasant bread was dark, dense, and made from whatever grains grew locally. Rye and barley were common, with wheat reserved for the wealthy. A typical peasant might eat 1 to 2 pounds of bread every single day. That's like eating an entire modern loaf by yourself. Porridge was another staple, cheap, filling, and easy to make. Just throw some oats or barley into a pot with water, and you've got yourself a meal. Beans, peas, onions, garlic, and turnips rounded out the daily fare. These vegetables were usually grown in small garden plots right next to the peasant's home. Would you like some meat with your bread? Sorry, we're fresh out. How about some more bread instead? This joke would have made perfect sense to a medieval peasant. Meat was special, not an everyday thing. Most peasants might enjoy meat only during feast days or special occasions, perhaps 40 to 50 days a year if they were lucky. Pork was the most common, as pigs were relatively easy to raise on scraps and forage in nearby woods. Fresh fish was available to those who lived near rivers or the coast. But for inland peasants, salted herring became a crucial protein source, especially during Lent when church rules forbade meat. One interesting food fact: eggs were more accessible than meat, providing crucial protein when meat wasn't available. Now, about drinks, water wasn't always trusted, and for good reason. It could make you sick. Instead, ale was the everyday drink for everyone, including children. Records from medieval England show that an adult male laborer could drink up to a gallon of ale daily. Before you picture drunk peasants stumbling around fields, know that medieval ale was weaker than modern beer. Though still, those farming fields with a slight buzz might explain some of the crooked rows. Preparing medieval meals was no quick drive-through experience. A peasant woman, because cooking was almost always women's work, might spend hours each day just making bread. First grinding grain by hand, mixing dough, letting it rise, then baking in a communal oven or under hot ashes at home. Compare that to our 2-minute microwave meals. During good harvest years, this diet provided enough calories to sustain hard physical labor. But one bad harvest could change everything. Crop failures due to weather or war meant serious hunger. Food security was always uncertain. Medieval accounts describe desperate measures during famines, grinding tree bark into flour or boiling leather to make soup. Seasons dramatically affected what was available. Late winter and early spring, known as the Hungry Gap, were especially tough when stored food was running low and new crops weren't ready. Fall, right after harvest, brought relative abundance. One medieval festival tradition involved baking extraordinarily large loaves of bread after the grain harvest, some reportedly weighing over 40 pounds. The foods that filled peasant bellies sustained them through harsh times and grueling work. While their bread-heavy meals might seem boring to our modern tastes, this simple diet was the foundation that kept medieval life going. But food was only one part of daily survival. Let's talk about medieval peasant homes. They weren't exactly featured in Better Homes and Gardens. A typical peasant house was tiny by today's standards, usually just 1 or 2 rooms where an entire family lived together. These weren't spacious open-concept layouts with walk-in closets and ensuite bathrooms. The basic structure started with a wooden frame made from whatever trees grew nearby. Pine, oak, elm, anything that could be cut down and shaped would do. Next came the walls, which were mostly wattle and daub, a fancy term for sticks woven together like a basket, then covered with mud mixed with straw, dung, and clay. This mixture dried hard and provided decent insulation against cold winds. Floors, nothing but hard-packed earth. Wall-to-wall carpeting meant scattered rushes or straw that caught all manner of dirt, crumbs, and little presents from the family dog. These floor coverings were changed only a few times a year, creating what must have been quite the aromatic experience. For the roof, bundles of straw, reeds, or whatever waterproof plant material was available were layered and tied together. A well-made thatch roof could last 20 years if maintained properly, but it also made a cozy home for mice, bugs, and birds. The peak of the roof often had a hole to let smoke escape from the fire below. Speaking of fire, heating and cooking happened around an open hearth right in the middle of the main room. No chimneys existed in most peasant homes until the late Middle Ages. Smoke would fill the upper part of the house before finding its way out through the roof hole or just seeping through the thatch. Windows were rare luxuries. Most homes had just small openings that might be covered with oiled paper, cloth, or wooden shutters during bad weather. Glass windows, those were for churches and rich folks. Medieval peasants could truthfully say they didn't need fancy curtains because they barely had walls. In winter, things got even more crowded when animals were brought inside. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs might share the space with humans. This wasn't because medieval peasants were especially fond of their livestock. It was simply practical. Animals generated body heat, keeping the house warmer, and it also prevented valuable animals from freezing to death or being stolen. Privacy didn't exist in these homes. Entire families slept in one room, often sharing a single large bed filled with straw. Children might sleep at the foot of their parents' bed or on the floor nearby. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were unwelcome but ever-present roommates. A fascinating fact. Studies of preserved medieval homes show that the average peasant dwelling in England was about 400 square feet. That's smaller than many modern studio apartments. A family of 5 to 8 people might live in this space together. Storage space was creative and limited. Ropes stretched across rafters held drying herbs and meat. Baskets hung from walls contained essential tools. Every inch of space needed a purpose, and nothing was wasted. These humble dwellings kept peasants mostly sheltered from weather and wild animals, but they were constantly in need of repair. After shelter and food came another daily concern: money talks, even in medieval times. But how much did a hard day's work actually pay for a peasant? Let's break down the medieval economy in terms we can all understand. Most peasants worked the land. From sunrise to sunset, they plowed fields, planted crops, harvested grain, and tended to animals. The work was backbreaking and constant, with different tasks depending on the season. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer brought weeding and maintenance. Fall was harvest time. Winter involved repairs, spinning wool, and other indoor tasks. For those who weren't tied to farming, other job options existed. Skilled trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, tanning, and weaving offered alternatives. Women often worked as brewers, bakers, or spinners alongside their household duties. Children as young as 7 started working, usually helping their parents or serving as apprentices. Now, for the big question, what did they earn? A typical unskilled laborer in England around the 1300s might make 1 or 2 pennies per day. Skilled workers earned more. Carpenters and blacksmiths could command 3 to 4 pennies daily. For context, a single penny then had much more purchasing power than our modern coins. What could a medieval penny buy? A decent loaf of bread cost about half a penny. A chicken would set you back 2 pennies. A gallon of that everyday ale went for roughly 1 penny. Cloth for a simple shirt might cost 3 or 4 pennies. Medieval budget advisors would have had a simple tip sheet. Monday, buy bread. Tuesday through Sunday, good luck. Most peasants lived close to the edge financially. One bad harvest or unexpected expense could push a family into debt, or worse. Paying for things worked differently back then. Actual coins were used less frequently than you might expect. Instead, many workers received payment in goods like food, housing, or the right to use land. A blacksmith might fix a farmer's plow in exchange for grain. A laborer might work extra days for the lord of the manor to pay rent on his small cottage. The concept of wages as we know them was still developing. Many peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They didn't receive salaries, but instead kept a portion of what they produced after giving the required amount to their lord. This system, called manorialism, meant your economic situation was largely determined by birth. Records from medieval England give us fascinating details about pay rates. After the Black Death killed nearly half the population in the mid-1300s, surviving laborers suddenly found themselves in high demand. Wages increased dramatically, in some cases doubling or tripling. This labor shortage alarmed authorities so much that England's King Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Like many minimum wage laws through history, Workers found creative ways around these restrictions faster than you can say under-the-table payment. Court records show frequent fines for workers who demanded higher pay than legally allowed. One mason in Oxford was caught accepting excessive wages of 5 pennies daily plus meals, a medieval version of salary plus benefits. While their homes offered basic shelter and their diets provided just enough nutrition, medieval peasants' wages gave them little opportunity to improve their situation. Yet surviving on these meager earnings was just one of many challenges they faced in their daily lives. There was more to medieval peasant existence than just working all day and counting pennies at night. Hard as it may be to believe, medieval peasants weren't working every single hour of their lives. They actually had days off, and more of them than you might expect. No, they weren't spending their free time scrolling through Ye Old Book or playing Angry Peasants on their stone tablets. The medieval work calendar revolved around religion. Sundays were mandatory rest days according to church law. Working on the Lord's Day could get you in serious trouble with both heavenly and earthly authorities. This weekly break gave peasants a day to attend church, rest their bodies, and spend time with family. But Sundays were just the beginning. The medieval calendar was packed with religious holidays and saints' days, somewhere between 40 and 50 days per year when work was forbidden. Add these to Sundays, and medieval peasants enjoyed roughly 1 day off for every 3 they worked. Major religious festivals like Christmas and Easter stretched across multiple days. For example, the Christmas celebration lasted 12 days, from December 25th to January 6th. During these periods, much regular work stopped completely. What did peasants do with this free time? For starters, they drank. A lot. Village alehouses served as the medieval equivalent of community centers where people gathered to gossip, sing, play games, and yes, consume impressive amounts of ale. Medieval drinking songs were probably the original karaoke, just as loud and just as off-key, but with more verses about farming. Physical games were incredibly popular. Medieval football looked nothing like modern soccer. It was a chaotic free-for-all where entire villages competed to move a ball from one landmark to another. Think of it as soccer meets rugby meets a tavern brawl, minus the yellow cards, but with extra bruises. With no referee and very few rules, these matches often ended with broken bones and bloody noses. Authorities repeatedly tried to ban these games because they were too violent and distracted people from archery practice, which was actually useful for national defense. Wrestling matches drew crowds of spectators. Strong young men would grapple and throw each other to prove their strength and win small prizes or just bragging rights. Records show that accidental deaths during these wrestling matches weren't uncommon. For less violent entertainment, peasants enjoyed music and dancing. Professional traveling musicians were rare treats, but many villages had talented locals who played pipes, drums, or stringed instruments. Simple circle dances would break out at festivals, with everyone from children to grandparents joining in. Storytelling filled winter evenings. With no television or internet, oral traditions thrived. Tales of heroes, saints, monsters, and magic passed down through generations. The medieval version of Netflix was just Grandpa by the fire, telling the same dragon story for the 100th time. And nobody could skip to the next episode. These weren't just entertainment. They preserved cultural values and practical knowledge. A fascinating fact, church records show complaints about peasants skipping Mass to attend plays or games, suggesting that even with limited options, medieval people still found ways to avoid boring obligations in favor of fun. Seasonal activities dotted the calendar. Spring brought maypole dances, where villagers wrapped a tall pole with ribbons while dancing in circles. Midsummer celebrations featured bonfires that people would jump over for good luck. Harvest festivals included competitions for the best crops and feasts where everyone contributed food. While modern historians once believed medieval peasants lived lives of unrelenting misery, evidence from court records, church complaints, and archaeological findings tell a different story. These people worked incredibly hard, but they also played hard during their time off. These moments of rest and celebration helped peasants cope with the harsh realities of medieval life. The ability to occasionally step away from work, share joy with neighbors, and forget their troubles for a moment was crucial. Of course, when the festivities ended, they returned to a world filled with other daily challenges that required different kinds of strength to overcome. When we picture medieval peasants, we often imagine filthy people who never bathed. Movies show them with blackened teeth and covered in muck. But is that really accurate? The answer might surprise you. First off, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses were common in towns until the late Middle Ages. People understood that cleaning themselves felt good and helped prevent certain illnesses. Many households had wooden tubs they'd fill with heated water for washing. During summer, streams and rivers served as natural bathing spots. Sir, your bath is ready. We've warmed the water to a perfect temperature of whatever temperature water happens to be when you carry it from the, well, bath time wasn't as convenient as turning on a faucet, but it existed. The idea that medieval folks avoided water completely is simply wrong. What about dental hygiene? Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist, but people still cleaned their teeth. They'd rub them with rough cloth, sometimes using mixtures of herbs, salt, or even crushed charcoal as an early form of toothpaste. Mouthwashes made from herbs like sage and mint helped freshen breath. These methods weren't perfect, but they weren't nothing either. That said, health problems were abundant. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries could become deadly if infected. A simple cut while working in the fields might lead to blood poisoning. Broken bones, if not set properly, could cause lifelong disability. Disease was the greatest threat. The Black Death famously killed between 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-1300s. But everyday illnesses took even more lives over time. Influenza, typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread quickly in crowded living conditions. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Many women died during delivery or from infections afterward. This partly explains why medieval women often had many pregnancies. Sadly, not all children survived to adulthood. Records from English villages show that for every 5 children born, only 2 or 3 might reach age 10. Medical treatment was a mix of practical knowledge and what we'd call superstition today. Got a headache? Your local healer might suggest a mix of willow bark tea, which contains natural aspirin, and wearing a special stone around your neck, which contains zero medicine whatsoever. Surprisingly, some medieval surgeons were quite skilled. They could set bones, remove bladder stones, and even perform basic eye surgery for cataracts. Most operations happened without anesthesia, though alcohol or opium sometimes dulled the pain. One common misconception involves medieval life expectancy. We often hear that people only live to be 30 or 40 years old. This is technically true, but misleading. The average was dragged down by extremely high infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, you had a decent chance of seeing 50 or 60 years, not so different from more recent history before modern medicine. Evidence from cemetery excavations shows many medieval peasants suffered from arthritis, likely from years of hard physical labor. Dental problems were common too, though not primarily from lack of cleaning. Coarse bread wore down teeth, and without dental care, any damage was permanent. The harsh realities of disease, injury, and limited medical knowledge meant medieval peasants faced health challenges at every turn. Yet even with these struggles, they still had to deal with another constant pressure in their lives. You think your taxes are bad? Let's talk about medieval money troubles. The medieval tax system wasn't just complicated, it was designed to extract as much as possible from those who had the least to give. Peasants lived under a constant reign of financial demands. First came rent to their lords. Most peasants didn't own their land outright. Instead, they held it from a noble lord and paid for that privilege, usually with a combination of money, crops, and labor. This wasn't a simple monthly payment. The amount could change based on harvests, the lord's needs, or simply because the lord said so. Next came the church tithe, a mandatory 10% of everything a peasant produced. That's right, 1/10 of all crops, animals, and products went straight to the church. And this wasn't optional or tax deductible. Church representatives would actually come to inspect your harvest to make sure you weren't holding back. Good news! The church only wants 10% of your crops. The bad news? Your lord wants the other 90%. This wasn't far from the truth for many medieval peasants. Random fees popped up constantly throughout a peasant's life. Need to use the lord's mill to grind your grain? That'll cost you. Want to marry? There's a fee for that. Did someone in your family die? Time to pay the harriet, a death tax where the lord took your best animal or tool. The most unusual fees came from strange medieval customs. For example, in some places, peasants had to pay a merchet when their daughters married, essentially compensating the lord for the loss of a worker. In other areas, lords had the right of first dibs on anything a peasant wanted to sell. What happens if you can't pay? The consequences were harsh. You might lose your land rights, be forced into extra labor, or even face imprisonment. Debt wasn't seen as an unfortunate circumstance, but as a moral failing and crime. Medieval records tell tales of creative payment methods when coins were scarce. One Yorkshire peasant paid his taxes with a bundle of arrows he had crafted. A family in Normandy settled their debt with their lord by providing him with a large cheese every autumn for 7 years. The total tax burden could be crushing. Studies of medieval English manners suggest peasants might surrender 20 to 30% of everything they produced through various payments. This doesn't sound drastically different from modern tax rates until you remember that medieval peasants were already living at subsistence level. Every egg taken in tax was an egg not feeding their children. Medieval tax collectors were the original inspiration for horror stories. Look out, here comes the Lord Steward was scarier than any ghost tale. Seasonal payments created another layer of stress. Most fees came due after harvest when peasants had crops to sell or trade. A poor harvest meant impossible choices between paying taxes or feeding your family. Court records reveal that peasants developed sophisticated strategies for managing these financial pressures. Some formed informal lending networks within villages. Others specialized in craft production they could sell for coins. Many simply negotiated payment plans or begged for mercy from their lords. The financial pressure cooker of medieval peasant life shaped every decision, from what crops to plant to how many children to have. Yet through all these hardships, medieval peasants found ways to survive and occasionally thrive, creating communities and traditions that would last for centuries, leaving a legacy that still influences our world today.